On my page for requesting reviews, one of my rules includes no request for pornography. There's a few reasons for this. One is to stop people from trolling me with requests for a Star Trek porn parody or whatever. Another is that excessively sexual video content could open this channel up to report and get it shut down. It has nothing to do with me thinking that media with explicit sexual content is not worth consideration and review. And it's not that I think sex is icky. I'm a pretty sex-positive person who thinks sex automatically equals an R rating is pretty silly. And since I've already discussed sexually explicit books like The Hunger and Time Warp Genesis, I figure I can get away with discussing erotica as long as I don't actually show any images of erotica. And it just so happens that the second review copy of a book I've ever received is a phone book-sized anthology of erotic short fiction. So let's put that to the test. Heart, Body, Soul, Erotica with Character is a 2015 anthology published by the New Smut Project, a small two-person operation whose tagline is Erotica for the Discerning Reader. The New Smut Project focuses on two things. One is promoting certain literary values in erotica, trying to keep things more complex than what is typical of written pornography, more complex characters with more realistic body types, a wider variety of settings and genres, actual pretense towards literary qualities. Its other focus is providing sex-positive, feminist-friendly, LGBT-friendly erotica, which largely means safe, consensual sex among many different orientations. Now, sex, perhaps more than most things, is a very subjective thing. What turns you on, what makes you go weak in the knees, is not going to be the thing for everybody. To that end, I don't think there's any wrong way to do erotica, in terms of subject matter. I mean, you can certainly suck at writing it. If you say prefer something more forceful and or less consensual in your fantasies, you should be able to enjoy that, just as long as you're a human being capable of delineating that fantasy from reality. So I don't give points simply because a book aims for erotica that is more socially progressive. I'm glad that it exists for the people who want that kind of material, but I don't consider it a factor in the book's overall quality. But that's okay, because I think Heart, Body, Soul is just pretty swell. Mostly. This is a phone book-sized anthology, nearly 430 pages, with 19 stories of various length, style, and genre. And I would say about 2/3 of them are pretty good, which I think is a good average for something like this. I'm gonna go into this pretty scattershot. I'll try to say something about each story, but not everything will get the same amount of attention. One reason is that the lengths of these stories vary wildly. The very first story, Close Pairs by Andrew Mettello, is only 6 pages long, which is about enough time for the sex and a quick joke at the end. On the opposite sides of things, we have Mistress of Victories by T.C. Mill, which sits at 49 pages and uses that space for multiple sex scenes and exploring a fantasy mythology involving modernized takes on Loki and Sigyn. They're both good stories, they simply have different priorities, be they economy of story or injecting literary prose. About the only ideas connecting these stories is that all the sex is consensual and the mantra of erotica with character, which doesn't mean the same thing to different writers. Eglantine's Red Right Returning, a gay romance between two teenage boys in the late 1980s, focuses on human connections through small moments and fine details. Intimacy derived from texture, temperature, and small touches. Ella Dawson's Very Impulsive, Very Angry focuses on the headspace of its leading lady as she tries to rationalize her sexual interest in one of her fellow students. Melinda T. Charvel's The Simpler Solution doesn't really make any attempt at deep characters, but instead opts for broader, fun characters in a kind of Terry Pratchett-light fantasy setting with magical hijinks leading up to a lesbian sex scene on a bridge. In these 3 stories, you have characters you share an intimate space with, characters who share their thoughts with the reader, and characters that are just fun to read. All very different approaches, but all could be argued to fit under the idea of erotica with character. The story that fits in the least with what this anthology is trying to accomplish would be Dr. Charles Cleans House by Paul Henry. It's a pretty stock porn plot about an older gentleman getting it on with a cleaning lady, with some comically over-the-top seduction moments. "Oh dear, I seem to have run water all over my shirt. Guess I can't hide the fact that I'm not wearing a bra, can I?" Hammy stuff like that. Its attempt at erotica with character is by giving the man a couple of dead kids, and also a vague dementia-like disease that results in a lot of short-term memory loss, a la Memento. First off, it feels like the dead kids were tacked on to a pre-existing story when Henry saw what the new smut project was looking for. I'm not saying that's what happened, that's just what feels like happened. Secondly, the tonal shifts aren't earned. These are the goofiest, porniest characters in the whole book. And thirdly, not only is this story the weakest fit in terms of erotica with character, but I think it also breaks the all the sex is consensual rule. Can a character with chronic, consistent short-term memory loss truly be able to consent? This guy's character is a horn dog, out of necessity, so that you can logic it away with like, oh sure, he's forgotten that he consented multiple times, but he's the kind of guy who would never turn down sex, so it's okay. I'm pretty surprised this story made the cut. Also kind of on the porny side is Creatures of the Night by Tiana Tatanov, which involves a three-way between a small weenie guy and two women, one of whom is a werewolf, the other a vampire, because mummy girls don't get no love. It's a very deviant RT setup. I would almost call it male wish fulfillment if the writer wasn't a woman. The dialogue is pretty stiff and unnatural, and having 2/3 of the parties involved be fantasy creatures do raise a few world-building questions that the story doesn't bother to answer. Like, the story has an emphasis on condoms and other means of normal, real-world protection, but traditionally lycanthropy and vampirism are transferable conditions, which would seem to require an extra level of protection. They don't really discuss it. At one point, the werewolf woman bites the guy, and all I could think for the rest of the story was, well, shit, he's a werewolf now. He caught an STD, and that STD was werewolf. That turns out not to be the case, but it was a distraction from reading about this vampire woman pegging some guy. However, Creatures of the Night is one of the few stories here with alternative body types. The werewolf is a taller, larger African-American woman, and the vampire is a very short, blind Asian woman. And these are the exceptions to the norm. For a group of writers that are predominantly Tumblr feminists and fanfiction writers, they do seem to default to traditionally attractive white characters. In terms of race, unless I'm missing something here, the only other story with a non-white participant is Kinbaku for Beginners by T.R. Verton, a story about a gay couple getting into bondage for the first time. One of the guys is of South American origin, or at least has a South American origin name. The male lead of Mistress of Victories is described as having copper skin, but that could mean anything from African American to Native American to white guy with tan, so I'm not really counting it. As for body types, one of the women in the simpler solution is on the chubby side of things, but the only real alternative body type story, which is to say a story where the point is that one or both of the participants are not supermodel thin, is Enjoy the Present by Spencer Cole, which involves a larger woman and a younger, thinner man having a very involved Christmas morning. That story also embraces the inevitable clumsiness of sex. Bumping into things wrong, two partners not entirely in sync but working it out anyway. Outside of that, characters are thin and white. Other patterns emerge as well. The majority of the stories involve college-aged adults dealing with college-age problems. Maybe they're in college, like in Very Impulsive, Very Angry. Maybe they dropped out, like in Kinbaku for Beginners. Maybe they're ditching class, like in Red Right Returning. Maybe they're walking across Europe and decide to bone their old professor, like in Mr. by Sue Liana 6. I hope I'm pronouncing these names right. Maybe they're walking across Europe and decide to bone a ghost, like in The Light at the End by Rose Sateo. There's a lot of young white women trying to discover themselves here, which is fine. There's a market of young white women trying to discover themselves who also want to get off. But I admit I went into this book on the assumption that there was going to be a little more token effort in providing variety in other areas besides sexual orientation. There are other settings, of course. Kitty Gamble's Advisedly and Soberly is a Jane Austen-style historical piece about the negotiations of power in marriage, which is actually really sweet. These two aren't really in love with each other, but they have a good friendship and they see the practical benefits of their union, and it's so neat to see after I got spoiled on Victoria Holt. Kara Stanton's The World Turned Upside Down is a goofy bit of historical action, with pre-revolution Thomas Jefferson and his lady doctor/bar dancer lover trying to avoid cloaked figures who want them dead because the doctor discovered the theory of evolution almost 100 years before Darwin. It's silly as hell. There's Hannah Lockhart's Judith and Eleanor, about a lesbian couple in the roaring 20s, though it's pretty much another college-aged thin white girl story, just with gramophones. And there are pure genre settings. Evader Volney's Tempestuous involves lesbian pirates on desert islands, casting spells through sexual content, and it's really good. It tells a lot with very little. The only questionable element here is that at the end of the story, there's a bit explaining who these characters are and what this whole thing is supposed to be, which at first left me impressed by how much thought was put into it. Then I felt a little deflated, like a magician had just shown me their secrets. The only science fiction story in the lot is D. Masel's Territories, and unfortunately, in this reviewer's opinion, it's the worst story of the lot. The story takes place in some kind of Blade Runner style not too distant future, but doesn't utilize that setting at all. All of its world building is just a distraction from the BDSM in an office setup. If you cut out the first couple of paragraphs and change the names of the characters, this could just as easily be Mad Men fanfiction. That's how much the setting doesn't matter. It's better at this kind of setup than 50 Shades of Grey, I'll give it that. It's more accurate to the BDSM scene. Also, there's some really hand-fisted symbolism with a go board, but the story doesn't trust you to work it out, so it explains that symbolism at the end. And don't do that. Don't ever do that. For the record, my favorite story of the lot was The Light at the End. I know I kinda waved it off as ghost sex, but it's seriously well written. Great pacing, great detail, great sense of mystery, electrifying erotica. Rose Sateo is gonna be a name I keep an eye open for in the future. I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. Also good is The Dressing Room by Guinevere Chase, one of the two stories in this collection involving trans men, the other being close pairs. No trans women, oddly enough. The final two stories in the collection I've saved for last because they're an interesting case study of two writers approaching the same subject matter. We have Leap of Faith by Joe Matheson and Tryst by Alex Freeman. Both are stories about a homosexual relationship between two military personnel who served in the Middle East. One's gay, the other's bisexual, one of them suffered injuries from an explosive, and both stories are almost the exact same length. They're like a 2/3 of a page difference between them. Despite all of that, these two stories cannot be more different in tone, pacing, and priorities. Tryst hinges on the taboo of soldiers getting it on the battlefield, and it gets to that stuff almost immediately. Spend a page introducing the characters, then bam, blowjobs all around. There's some faintly implied magical realism concerning a statue, the fertility goddess Inanna, but I'll admit I'm a bit lost as to the point of it all. By contrast, Leap of Faith is a true romantic short story. We see our two characters meet, we see them get to know each other, go on dates, get more comfortable around each other. These are really three-dimensional characters, and the sex is saved at the end, where it feels earned, like these characters are beginning a new chapter in their life. Also, both of these characters have a disability. One has hearing loss and the other is missing a few fingers, and the story is genuine and respectful in portraying those things. One of the characters in Tryst gets hurt by a bomb, but that just leaves him with some scars that don't affect his abilities or sexual capabilities. The story really hits the, well, that was easy button on that. Leap of Faith is the more mature story by about a head, and that's what I found myself gravitating to more often than not. Sillier stories, stories with gimmicks, stories that seem more like traditional internet porn. There's nothing wrong with those things. But on the more subjective matter of erotica, I personally am more drawn to stories that are putting in an effort to take its subject matter seriously. So here's a list of all the stories from my favorite to my least favorite. Not necessarily the ones I got off to, let's not try and suss out my preferences from this, just the ones I enjoyed reading the most for their literary merits. Anthologies can be tough to review. Covering 19 different narratives in the same space I would usually be talking about just one means I'm only really scratching the surface on what this book has to offer. And what it has to offer is several niches that you may or may not belong to. Well, that's the trouble with recommending erotica. Whatever turns one person on might not turn on the next person. But if you saw anything you liked in this video, then Heart, Body, Soul is a winner in my books. Plus, you're supporting small publishers, and that's gotta make you feel good, right?